This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, the subject is the religion of Jainism. I have two experts in the field, and the conversation will begin in a moment. This is another show on the origins and the histories and the tenets of religions. This time the subject is Jainism, and I have Jeffrey Long and Christopher Chappell here to speak on it. As I usually like to do, I want to give my guests a few minutes to introduce themselves and what drew them to the subject. So let me start with you, Jeffrey, who's on the left side of the screen. If you could give a little background about who you are and what first drew you to religions in general and Jainism specifically.
Okay, my name is Jeffrey Long, and I am a professor of religion, philosophy, and Asian studies at Elizabethtown College in Pennsylvania. I grew up in a small town in Missouri, and I became drawn to studying religion at a very early age. My father passed away when I was 12. He was in a pretty terrible accident, and that got me thinking very deeply about all the big philosophical questions. What happens after we die, if anything? What's the meaning and purpose of suffering? Why do we go through the things that we do as human beings? And I began exploring many different traditions, and I began reading whatever I could find. I studied whatever I could gather on Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, Taoism, Islam. I looked at a wide variety of traditions, including the tradition in which I grew up, which was the Catholic faith. And I found myself particularly drawn to the traditions of India. There's a lot about the Indian traditions, Indian culture that appealed to me. And some of this came through Western pop culture. I was always a fan of the Beatles. You know, they studied meditation in India. George Harrison, I'm a big fan. And so that led me to reading the Bhagavad Gita and studying Hinduism. And then my interest in Jainism really took off more when I was in graduate school. I decided early on to be a professor and study this field because I enjoy it so much. And one particular area that interests me is something called pluralism, the idea that there are many paths to truth, many ways of being that are valid and that can be affirmed. And I wanted to make an argument for this in my dissertation. And I was studying Indian philosophy, and I found that the Jain tradition has this beautiful system of logic. And they have this doctrine called Anekantavada, which means the teaching of the many-sidedness of reality. I found this very appealing, so I wrote my dissertation on that. And then later, I was encouraged to write an introductory textbook on the Jain tradition, and that was published in 2009. Dr. Chappell, who's with us today, Chris, very kindly reviewed it and wrote a little blurb on the back. I've always found him to be very supportive of my work through the years. I'm grateful to be here with him today. And I'd have to say that since my book on Jainism came out in 2009, I think I've learned more about the tradition since then than I knew when I wrote the book. So if I ever have the opportunity to write a second edition, I'm very keen to do that.
Before I go on to Christopher, I just want to pick up on something you once said, because when I've talked with people about religion, whether it's religious scholars or historians, or whether it's just people talking about their own particular faiths and beliefs, I just wanted to ask you, uh, what is your take on Jainism? Is Jain, because when I've spoken with Buddhists, Buddhists have told me that they look at Buddhism as more of a philosophy rather than a religion. Uh, so is there a hint of supernaturalism in the Jainist belief? And you had mentioned also truth and the many sides of reality. And I've always said truth and reality are totally different things. Truth is always a comment on the underlying reality. Let me just ask you that. One, is there supernatural beliefs within Jainism? And two, is there a difference between truth and reality in your view of Jainism?
Okay, so um, supernatural beliefs, it really depends on how we define the word supernatural. So, in one sense, I would say no, because the Jain worldview, and we'll see this as Chris and I discuss it today, it's an entirely self contained worldview. There is no idea of a deity standing outside of the world and intervening in it or interfering with it or disrupting its normal workings. Everything follows very regular natural laws. On the other hand, if by supernatural you mean something that goes beyond what modern science might affirm, what's available to the senses, then yes, because Jains teach that there's such a thing as karma, there's such a thing as the jiva, that is the living soul of each being. There's a process of rebirth, what often in the West is called reincarnation. But in a Jain worldview, that's all seen to be part of nature, right? That's all. Everything I've described is seen as perfectly natural. So it really comes down to how you define words like supernatural, and even whether you call it a religion, philosophy, or way of life. It really kind of depends on what meaning we're investing into those words. In terms of truth and reality, I'm going to fall back on my Sanskrit training. In the Indian traditions, the term for reality is sat, that which is, and then you have satya, which is truth. So truth is, in some sense, derivative from reality. Truth is uh, an accurate description, if you will, of reality. And so the two concepts are very, very closely interlinked. That there is reality and truth is what is the case about reality. So they're very closely interlinked in not only the Jain tradition, but I would say this is generally true in most Indian traditions.
Christopher Chappell is my other guest. Christopher, as I asked of Jeffrey, can you give me a little background about yourself and how you came to your interest in religion generally and specifically Jainism?
Okay, very good. So my name is Chris Chappell. I'm the Doshi Professor of Indic and Comparative Theology at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles. And I grew up, like Jeff, in the countryside. So being 3 miles outside of a village of 700, a few miles south of the shores of Lake Ontario, midway between Rochester and Niagara Falls, we were just given over to wander. And there were 6 of us, and we just did forest, fields, meadows, no mountains, flat plain. And our dad we're talking about our dads. My dad did live to old age, thankfully, but he'd been adopted in by the Ojibwe as a youth and would bring us regularly into the forest. And he taught us how to walk without making noise, and he taught us how to observe. And during those solitary walks and rambles through all 4 seasons, there was just this stirring that in the silence of being supported in nature, something special was happening. And then, you start growing up. When I must have been about 12, my older sister came home from college with a copy of the Upanishads. And I was part of the Methodist Youth Fellowship. And in high school, I became part of Wakefield Players Guild, and we performed miracle, mystery, and passion plays all over upstate New York through my high school years. So this was a way of, through the theatrical experience and the training that we had, Stanislavski training about going inward, there was this affinity for the biblical narratives that was not simply theoretical, but an experience of embodiment, if you will. And my good friend and I, Ken Ketwig, went to visit. By this time, we'd moved 60 miles away, closer to the city of Rochester. And our farm, where we rented this old 1815 farmhouse. By that time, there were only 4 kids left at home. The other 3 of us left at home, the other 3 away at college. We rented from the family that helped sponsor Philip Kapleau to establish the Rochester Zen Center in 1967. And he wrote this marvelous book called 3 Pillars of Zen, which I avidly read in 8th grade. And when we went to visit him, he was very affirming. He was sort of impressed that these 13-year-olds had read his book. I ended up doing a big presentation in 9th grade about that very book, and I still have it in my file drawers here. And however, he said, I have people coming from all over the world. We just do not have a program for youth. It was very nice to meet you. I kept on with doing Zazen every morning and often in the evening. And then a couple of years later, landed at the Religious Society of Friends, the Quakers, so that on Sundays I was either in silent meditation or performing a miracle mystery passion play somewhere or other. And of course, one thing led to another, and I went off to college, and lo and behold, quickly became a religious studies major, double major with comparative literature, taking a lot of philosophy, and met a woman from Calcutta. And I know Jeff will be sharing about his involvement with the Vedanta Society. This is sort of a cousin movement, but I began a very intensive 12-year training with a woman who quickly became my wife. And we, in this community, would regularly practice the yamas and niyamas of yoga, everyday asana, pranayama, and also the building of a community education center, a restaurant, all happening simultaneously as we finished our undergraduate degrees, our graduate degrees, got established in our first jobs before moving to Los Angeles in 1985. So that period, 1972 to 1985, intense yoga training in the style of Patanjali, Bhagavad Gita, and so forth. So I did my PhD dissertation at Stony Brook, rather at Fordham University, my undergraduate at Stony Brook University. And I was really taken because I'd had several years of reading primary sources, both in Sanskrit and in Tibetan, both from the Hindu tradition and the Buddhist tradition. And it was like, self? No self? What's going on here? And discovered in the Yoga Vasishta a reconciliation, and wrote my dissertation on the concept of will, Parusha, translating chapters on that topic from that remarkable 1,000-year-old text. And as I walked into my very first faculty party, shortly, I mean, days after having defended my dissertation at Fordham, Robert Neville, the head of the department, who went on to become the dean of theology at Boston University, said, well, it's very nice that you finished your dissertation, but what is your next project? And that's what brought me into Jainism, and the combination of the background with the Quakers and the weekly practice of ahimsa stirred up in me this concern for really understanding all of the nuances of the practice of nonviolence. And that particular week was a week of the meltdown of 3 Mile Island. And I stammered in my 25-year-old embarrassed self and said, well, what I want to do is see how nonviolence can help address the world's environmental issues. And again, this was in 1980, and we're still grappling with how to address the world's environmental issues. But we were part of really a first wave that got involved with that. And I spent those 5 years at the Institute going through all of the resources I could find for the study of Jain faith and practice, began teaching Jainism, it must have been in 1981 or 1982 at Stony Brook, and brought to campus Pavanab Jaini, the remarkable author of a book called The Jain Path of Purification, which just opened the universe for so many of us. And like Jeff, my first book that included my Jain studies, this is actually my second book, Now I read it and I say, well, I didn't really get it wrong, but I know so much more now. And Jeff has been very kind in really affirming the work that I've been able to modestly put forth. And I think that for both of us, we're most interested in communicating the heart and soul of faith. And we have to do lots of different things along the way.
A couple of comments, a few comments on what you said. When you went to talk about the woman from Calcutta, I thought you were going to go into that old limerick there. But couple of points. You pronounced it just now as Jainism. So what have I been pronouncing it wrong? It's Jainism, not Jainism?
You're modern, and Jeff and I are old school.
Okay.
And the AI in Sanskrit is I.
Okay.
And the AI in modern, even modern Hindi, can become Jain.
Okay. Because actually, I was listening to a YouTube thing of songs before I contacted you guys, and that old Jefferson Starship song Jane came on. I thought it was a sign, but now it should have been Jine. Also, too, I wanted to comment that you said you grew up. I once went to the SUNY Brockport in the University of Brockport. Did you ever teach there, or did you ever go there, Christopher?
Oh, I saw an opera there once.
Okay.
And it's quite a campus, but it sounds like you're from downstate.
Yeah, I'm from New York City, but I went up there for a writers conference many years ago. But anyway, let's get talking about the religion itself, its history, and its precepts. I was just looking online here, and apparently, like many religions, there is a schism, at least a major schism between two different paths of Jainism. So how did it begin, and what are what schisms have there been? Let's just talk functionally, the business, if you will, of the religion. How it, either one of you want to take that?
Sure. I can. You want to start, Chris?
No, you go, and then I'll come with a different angle.
And you can come with a different angle. Okay, that sounds good. So, one might be tempted to trace the history of Jainism to a figure named Mahavira. He was, we believe, a contemporary of the Buddha, so probably lived around the 6th or 5th century BCE. One would be tempted to do that, but then most Jains would tell you actually that's not correct, because according to the Jain tradition, there have been a series of 24 such teachers, enlightened beings, and Mahavira is the 24th in that lineage. And there is some evidence, if we look purely from a historical perspective, not from within the worldview of Jainism, that there was a pre-existing tradition that Mahavira was tapping into when he began his teaching. His life story and that of all of these figures is quite similar to what we find in Buddhism about the life of the Buddha. Mahavira, that is, was born to privilege. His father was a ruler of one of the many small kingdoms or city-states that were in India during the first millennium BC. Came from roughly the same region as the Buddha, so the eastern half of the Ganges River Valley. And from an early age felt drawn to spiritual life, which what that meant in ancient times in India was that one began to feel the inevitability of death, of change, of suffering in the world, and a desire to discover some solution to that. And so very much as the Buddha would also do, around the age of 30, Mahavira is said to have left his life of royalty, took the permission of his parents, unlike the Buddha who ran away from home. Mahavira took the permission of his parents and became what is called a renouncer, a wandering monk, if you will, focused on meditation and cultivating states of higher awareness, and very centrally for Mahavira's path, nonviolence, ahimsa, which is not only nonviolence, but its absence of even the desire to do harm to any living thing. And by cultivating this path, it's said that after 12 years, He attained enlightenment. In the Jain tradition, you hear the term nirvana, as you find in Buddhism, but more often you hear this term kevala jnana, which means unique knowledge, absolute knowledge. And for the rest of his life, till the age of 72, he taught his path and established, reestablished, we would say, the Jain community, which was based on even the teachings of these earlier figures that predate Mahavira. This tradition existed more or less as a singular community and tradition for a number of centuries, but we know that around the 2nd century or so before the Common Era, there was a famine which occurred in this northern region of India where Jainism was based. This was also the home base, if you will, of what became the Maurya Empire, the Maurya dynasty. And it's said that the founder of the Maurya dynasty, Chandragupta Maurya, was himself a Jain, and that there's a story that in later years he renounced his kingship and became a Jain monk, or Jain monk, depending on which pronunciation we're following. And so one consequence of this famine was that the Jain community divided. There were people who went west and ultimately ended up in the region of what are now the states of Gujarat and Rajasthan in western and northwestern India. And another group went south into what's now Karnataka in southern India, and then even further into Tamil Nadu. And probably due to that geographic separation, some differences emerged in the monastic practice of the two groups. And this became the basis of the division between what are called the Shvetambara Jains. The monks in the Shvetambara tradition wear white garments, simple white garments. That's what Shvetambara means. It means white clad. The monks in the other tradition, the Digambara tradition, that means sky clad. And they're called that because the monks don't wear anything at all. It's a complete renunciation. It's probably the most difficult form of monastic practice known to humanity, at least as far as I know. I think the life of a Digambara monk is quite difficult.
So we're talking
And
they're totally nude, even during the winter?
totally nude, even during the winter, right? Even during the winter. Now, winters in India are gentler than in upstate New York or Missouri, but still, it does get cold. Um, what one typically finds, at least today, and I think this has been the case for the last few centuries, is that the Digambara monks typically live a cloistered life. They stay in a monastery. You won't typically find them wandering from place to place, though at times in history they have done so. And they've sometimes faced ridicule and abuse because of that, because it's as strange in India for people to be walking around naked as it would be in America, right? There are people whose sensibilities are offended by that. But according to the Digambara teaching, to attain Kevala Jnana, one has to be completely detached from the body. So any sense of shame or discomfort has to be overcome. So the monks perform this practice. And
Jeffrey, if I can just ask you one thing, you
yeah.
said that you said something about the divorce between the body and the person. So is this one of the things that causes them to meditate, to transcend the body?
Well, that's part of it, right? Because according to Jain teaching, our true identity is not the physical body. The physical body, and this we see in Hinduism as well, it's like clothes that the soul is wearing, right? That during this particular lifetime, based on our karmas, based on our past actions, we take on a particular type of body. And then, depending on our karma at the death of the body, we take on another body. The soul, what we're translating as soul, the word is actually jiva, which is from the Sanskrit verb jivati, means to live. So it's the life force. And there's a very good book on Jainism by another author, Michael Tobias. It's called Life Force, and it's talking about this concept of the jiva. And so the idea is to identify fully with that and not with the physical body. It is the pursuit of the comforts and pleasures and the avoidance of discomfort in the physical body that is one of the things that actually keep us attached to the process of rebirth. The goal is to become free from the process of rebirth, and one does that by a complete identification with the jiva, with the soul. When that occurs, one then is liberated. When one is enlightened, one realizes one's complete separation from the body, and the jiva, the soul, ascends to a realm called the Siddhaloka, the realm of the perfected ones. And that's where the enlightened beings all reside for eternity. And the aim of ultimate aim of Jain practice is for all of us to become that, to achieve that very goal, which is believed to be very difficult. And it takes many lifetimes of rigorous practice. But the faith is that it does eventually occur, and that the true nature of the soul emerges. We identify with that, and then we're free.
Chris, you wanted the other angle? Go ahead.
Yeah, I thought I would talk about the emergence of the denominations, the Digambara and Svetambara, in terms of the stories that have come down to us through history. And the story is that around 300 BC, there was a terrible, terrible climate-induced famine. And famine is periodic throughout the history of India. And the monsoon will bring rain every June, July, August, September, bring rain year after year during those 3 or 4 wonderful months. However, sometimes the monsoon fails. And under the rule of an emperor called Chandragupta, it is said that the monsoon failed again and again and again in his area, which, as Jeff pointed out, the northeast area around Benares, modern Benares, and a little bit more to the north. And what happened was Chandragupta just sort of said, I'm done. And he gave over his failing community to his son. And then actually his grandson is reported to have been the Emperor Ashoka, who brought Buddhism throughout the noble reign that by that time the monsoons had returned, prosperity had returned. But in the meantime, Chandragupta went all the way to the south. And I think that we've all heard of the great tech city of Bangalore, a British outpost that was long before that had sprung into being, but he went down to a place called Shravanabelagola, and that's south of Bangalore in the southern state of Karnataka. And he went up on a mountaintop there, and he fasted as he reached his old age, after having practiced Jain monasticism for many years. And with that, he had brought into the Jain faith those who had followed him, who then began to promulgate the faith among the people of South India. And as Jeff pointed out, it is a bit warmer in the south than in the north. And it was in the south that the Digambara, that is, that the tradition of nakedness took root. And it is interesting, I think Jeff and I have both been to Kun Kun Bharati, which is a wonderful Jain mini seminary in Delhi, where many young men are called to take the vow of Jain monasticism. And they have to make compromises because it gets very, 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 very cold in India in the north. And they actually have little huts within this building where they have a light bulb that will keep them safe in the bitter cold of those cold Delhi nights. But what happened was that as that community moved south, another group of Jains, again, 2,300 years ago, moved more to central India and to the west. And that community became designated as the Svetambara community. And they were telling different stories about the life of Mahavira. they were affirming different literature as definitive and canonical. And they were not in dispute with one another. They were just not aware of one another. And this tradition now has continued. Okay, Svatambaras do this, Digambaras do that. But not only can they be found in virtually all parts of India, in all parts of the globe, you will find both Svatambara and Digambara affiliated people. Some Digambaras from the north, some Svatambaras from the south. And one of the hallmarks of American Jainism is that the early founders of the temples here in North America were very careful to include in their both liturgical practice as well as in the placement of icons and images, both traditions. So the Digambara tradition, you'll see gleaming, unadorned marble statues that show Mahavira, Parshvanath, and the others, and they will be right alongside, or perhaps in a niche a little bit different from the Svetambara images, which are quite resplendent with color and various forms of adornment. So this tradition is very interesting because there are these two that do not agree on some aspects of the faith, primarily narratives and the issue about nakedness for the most advanced monks, no nakedness for nuns in either tradition. And with this, we are sort of put into a place of both like, wow, this is an historical moment that had profound consequences, and virtually all of those teachings that Jeff put forth are shared by both faiths. They believe in the jiva. They believe that karma adheres to the jiva through our various actions, and they are both agreed that the process of Jain spirituality, known variously as adhyatma, reflection upon the soul, or yoga, going to that highest place, both traditions assert that one must follow the ethic, the vrata, the vows of nonviolence, truthfulness, not stealing, sexual restraint, and renunciation, aparigraha, in order to allow those karmas that have built up through this lifetime and from past lifetimes, in order for them to just melt away and allow one to literally stand in a place of eternal awareness and bliss.
So I want to talk a little bit more about some of the different beliefs within Jainism, as well as things that might be unique to it. I had mentioned, I believe, to Jeffrey before you came on, Christopher, that I had recently done a show on Baha'i. And one of the things I found a little surprising, given that Baha'i is only a couple of hundred years old, not even a couple of hundred, is that they had some difficulty with different types of sex and sexuality, even though they were progressive in a lot of other ways. So let's talk about the role of women, because you mentioned nuns. Let's talk about the role of women within the Jain belief system. And since everything is reincarnated or reborn within the Jainist belief system, I would think that would mean that men sometimes become women in a life, women sometimes become men in a life. What is then the Jain view on sexuality, homosexuality, and the modern Western ideas of gender? Jeff, if you want to take that first.
Oh, sure. Yes, as you rightly said, according to the Jain tradition, whatever body we inhabit is a function of our karma, and the jiva itself is genderless. So It could be born in a male body, it could be born in a female body. And regarding sexuality, broadly speaking, the Jain attitude is, you could say, twofold. And you see a similar twofold approach in the Buddhism and Hinduism as well. By twofold, what I mean is this: there is sexual morality, sexual ethics for householders, ordinary people, right? People who have spouses, typically children, jobs, and so forth. And so for them, the expectation, as it is in most religions, is marital fidelity, and sexuality being seen as something whose really primary function is to bind the family together and to be an occasion for procreation and so forth. However, that is at the level of the householder. According to Jain teaching, one wants to eventually, if not in this lifetime, in some future lifetime, set aside the life of the householder and take up the monastic path, take up the ascetic path, because sexuality and sexual desire, like other forms of desire, is one of the things that keeps us pulled back into the cycle of rebirth. So one does want to eventually transcend that. And when one reaches the point where one feels that's possible, then that's when you can take up the life of a Jain monk or nun. There are people who become Jain monks or nuns at a very young age, but many, quite a few, will take up the ascetic path after the death of a spouse. So you can see almost a kind of natural progression from the householder life into a more of a monastic existence in those cases. But sexuality as such, it's not seen as something evil or bad in a kind of puritanical sense, but that it is seen as one of those things that is perilous, that can pull us into the cycle of rebirth if it becomes an excessive preoccupation. So the idea is to eventually transcend and go beyond sexual desire. Also, and this is where things get really interesting, one of the big concerns in the Jain tradition, again, is nonviolence. And there's also a very keen awareness that there are tiny, tiny life forms everywhere, on surfaces, in the air, in water, and on and inside of our bodies. There are tiny life forms. Now, a number of things about this are very intriguing. First of all, how did they know that over 2,000 years ago? Because these things are described in great detail in very old texts, and yet microscopes weren't invented until comparatively recently. But this is a very old Jain idea. There are tiny life forms everywhere. So the more evolved one becomes on the spiritual path, the more one becomes aware of and mindful of those tiny life forms. And when it comes to sexuality, there is a belief that the sexual act itself is harmful to small life forms in the body. So that's another reason to refrain from sexual activity, because it's seen as violent, right? Now, ordinary people, ordinary Jain practitioners, householders, for example, aren't expected to have that level of mindfulness. But for ascetic practitioners, yes, monks and nuns, the idea is one is a part of the practice of nonviolence is also a practice of continence when it comes to sexuality.
So a
Now,
particularly lusty monk who doesn't want to touch another person, would he be shamed if he's masturbating?
he would, yes, because if he still has that inclination, the monastic life is not really for him, and
Oh,
so
so there's a different set of expectations for a monk and just a off the street Jain.
absolutely very
Okay.
different set of expectations.
Okay.
And so becoming a monk is a very serious undertaking, and it's not for everyone, right? So but it is believed that's what you need to do if you want to get liberation anytime soon. So that is the idea. A couple other important things to note about sexuality. You mentioned homosexuality. Uh, there is a very interesting sort of, from a Western perspective, very modern and progressive outlook on this in one sense in the Jain tradition, because there's a distinction that's made between the gender of one's dravya, that means one's physical body, physical substance, and one's bhava, which is your emotions, what we would today call your orientation. And in Jain texts, they say it is possible to have, say, a male dravya, a male body, and maybe a female bhava, right, which would involve attraction to men. Now, it is a heteronormative discourse, right? It's assuming that the male disposition is heterosexual, but one can have a male body and a female disposition, and that's perfectly fine. And in fact, it's sometimes accounted for by the fact that maybe in your last lifetime you had a body of the other gender. So you're still carrying some of what are called the sanskaras, some of the dispositions, some of the habits of that previous life into this life. Now, in Jain society, the norm is generally taken to be heterosexual. You know, you get married or you join monastic life. But there's no warrant in the tradition for, as I understand it, for any particular bias against people who might have a homosexual orientation. And of course, all sexual orientations are seen as something ultimately to be overcome on the spiritual path. So that applies to everyone.
Let me just, if I
Sorry.
can, I
Yeah.
just want to involve Christopher here just to comment on something you had
Yes.
said earlier. And I think it's a kind of Western stolidity about the very concept of karma. Earlier, Jeffrey had mentioned that when I just brought up about sex and sexuality, that it depends upon one's karma. So am I to take from that, if let's say I'm a man and I'm a real son of a bitch, I abuse children or I abuse animals, I rape women, or I'm a Ted Bundy wannabe here. Does that mean that in the next life I will come back as that thing that I tortured or was evil towards? Am I going to return as an animal? Am I going to return as a woman so that perhaps I might feel what it's like to be vaginally raped? That's sort of what I just initially am assuming from what Jeff said. But is that is that my Westernism showing?
No, you're totally on point with that. And there are said to be 4 gatis, slightly simpler than the 6 realms of birth described in Buddhism. But the 4 are the human birth, which is the best birth. And from this birth, we're given an opportunity. We rarely take it, but we're given the opportunity to become free. Then or to become a heavenly being. And if one does a really good job with kindness and obeying all of these wonderful rules to follow, one will earn rebirth in one of the heavens. However, that type of Bundy character would undoubtedly have a fate either of becoming an animal given over to the animalistic desires, or could be cast down into hell. And the hells in Jainism, there's 7 of them, and they are beautifully illustrated and described. And one thing that they like to point out, both descriptively and visually, is that there's not many people there. There's not that many Ted Bundys in the world, thank goodness. But they are suffering just horrendous torture within that hell. And the idea is that by suffering that torture, those sins, that papa, will be expiated and they could earn, again, climbing out of hell into an animal birth, then animal birth after animal birth after animal birth, working back into human birth. So we don't really give up on people, but we put forward within this tradition the notion that there is no escape, that your good deeds will yield consequences and your bad deeds will always yield consequences.
So,
I also
is
want to, yeah,
go ahead. Finish your thought.
I just wanted to lift up what Jeff had said in terms of gender. And it's very specific. Pum's gender, male, Stri gender, female, and then Napumsika would be without either designation and perhaps taking on the affect of someone of the opposite gender. And there's long traditions of communities of people that choose that lifestyle within India.
So if I was some warlord that slaughtered bands of people ruthlessly trying to conquer some area, in the Jain belief, I might come back as a tiger, say. But if I'm a bad tiger, a man-eating tiger that stalks little human children, then I'm going to be even lower and lower. So, is there any end point in the hell that basically the fates or whatever say, this guy has been a son of a bitch from human down to mosquito. It's time to put him out of his misery.
No, you can never be killed. Everything has always been here. Everything will always be here. And there's no escape until you escape. But even then, you're in this vibratory place of energy, consciousness, and bliss. And you have this eternal happiness within this realm, which is called the Siddhaloka. And it's very interesting because sometimes you want to think about physics versus metaphysics. What you said, natural versus supernatural. But in this tradition, it's all natural and it's all physical.
So I'm assuming that the Jains have a belief in free will, because if there's no free will and then you're not responsible for your actions. So it would not make sense.
Everything is about free will. Yes, 108%.
So let me then ask about a couple of other things here. In regards to, well, obviously there are things about the animals. We're talking about animals, the different types of designations that we were talking about. Do Jains believe that there are other beings in the cosmos other than those on Earth that are equal to or greater than human beings? I.e., if the little green man in the UFO came down into Delhi and said, I am here, hello, people of Earth, would that being be considered on a par with human beings or even greater?
Oh, I love that question, and I want to lift up Mataji. And she is a nun, now octogenarian, who for more than 60 years has dedicated herself to building temples that reflect all of the Jain narratives about alternate realities. And just as in good old Isaac Asimov and Robert Heinlein science fiction, we have parallel universes. In Jainism, there are multiple parallel universes that are working on different timescales. And it's possible to jump from one birth in this realm of Jambudvipa into an alternate reality at a more auspicious time period where you could, in fact, very readily live in a golden age and very quickly ascend into that blessed place called the Siddhaloka. And there are plenty of pictures, paintings from back in the day of people in flying machines. And yes, all of those mind-expanding possibilities that so many of us immersed ourselves in middle school, high school, those realities still continue. So the Navi would not be out of the realm of possibility in Jain or Hindu faith and practice.
So let me go back to you, Jeffrey. One of the things that you were mentioning about sex and the need for restraint or abstinence, continence, if that goes to too much of a degree, doesn't that become counterproductive to the human race, or is this just for monks?
Well, it's just for monks. And I've had students ask me this question quite frequently. If everybody was celibate, wouldn't the human race die out? And my reply to that is always to ask, how likely do you think that is? That's going to occur. And even within the Jain community, which numbers, I think it's about 5 million today, there are only a few thousand monks and nuns. So it's not the majority of people who feel drawn to that way of life. So, and there's really not an expectation that all souls will simultaneously be at that same level of development where they will want to renounce worldly life. You've got your Ted Bundys down in the hells. You've got the animals. You've got human beings of all different kinds, and they are countless. Right, the term used in the Jain tradition is not literal infinity, but it means something like virtually infinite, countless, innumerable. There are so many souls, so many living beings, that this process is going to be continuing for a very, very long time. And there's also a question whether all souls will even get freedom, right? Get moksha. There is a concept in the Jain tradition of abhavya, that is, beings who they're not being punished or anything. They just never really conceive of the desire for freedom. They're quite happy to keep getting reborn again and again. A very famous Jain philosopher, Yashovijaya, lived a few hundred years ago. He was once asked, how do you know if you are going to be one of the souls that get liberation or not? And his reply is wonderful. He says, if you are concerned enough to ask that question, don't worry, you'll get liberated. It will occur. But it's the beings who just don't have any interest in it at all who won't, because it's difficult, right? It requires deliberately. You can't accidentally get liberation, right? In the Jain understanding, it requires a very concerted, multi-lifetime effort of completely purifying the mind and really releasing the soul from its karmic bonds, and that takes a lot of effort. So most people are not going to want to do that, and so there's no danger of population decline because everyone's rushing to become a Jain ascetic. That's very unlikely. There is an interesting story. Apparently, in one period of Tibetan history, that becoming a Buddhist monk was so popular that there was population decline at one point in Tibet. That's the only period in human history that I'm aware of where that's occurred due to monastic life.
Now, I was raised as a Lutheran, a Missouri Synod Lutheran, and I know there was the thing, the Protestant work ethic. Is there some equivalent in Jainism? And are things like laziness or drunkenness, are they considered as bad as, say, as I mentioned, doing some evil thing, some criminal thing to a child or an animal or a woman or something? What are there a list of sins in general, and are they viewed and repudiated in the same manner that Western religions will do so?
Yeah, I would say absolutely. And there's rich story traditions with the moral of the story being so critical. And the lists of do's and don'ts are extensive to the point that in the last third of one's life, the dietary expectations are extremely, extremely stringent. And one point that I don't think that we've really brought out sufficiently is the emphasis on vegetarianism, the recent embrace of veganism among many Jains, and the prevalence of fasting. And we think of Ramadan, we think of the old style Roman Catholic, no meat on Fridays. We think of Lent as periods of foregoance and forbearance. And in Jain tradition, this is the warp and move of the faith. These practices are called tapas, and they really come to define one's religiosity. And in fact, there's every fall, sometimes late August, sometimes early September, and the Digambaras and the Svetambaras disagree on the particulars of this, but they both follow it slightly differently. But they will have a challenge put forth. Who in our community can do without food and water for 7 days and 7 nights? And that degree of focus is remarkable. And the idea is that as you fast, just as you follow the vows, a burning off of karma takes place. And this carries over into yoga traditions as well, shared in common. We call Jainism, Buddhism, and yoga the shamanical traditions, but part of our training, which I've certainly continued for 50 years, is to fast 1 day a week. And the idea is that during that day, you're not fussing with food. During that day, you feel this heat build up in your body, and there's a little bit of energy that comes with regular fasting, as well as an affirmation of what you referred to earlier, that really it's human will that determines the worlds we live in. And by taking on one within oneself a vow, there's a strength that can be built.
Let me ask a couple of questions that probably are not usually associated with religions, but I do want to sort of tie this into someone watching a video like this, that we're not just talking esoterically. I want to talk about two people that I know who died and the different ways that they died. About a year ago, a friend of mine who was mentally ill but a great poet died. He slipped in his bathroom, hit his head on the bathtub or whatever, and they found his body 2 days later. Now, what is the Jain take on religion? Because oftentimes here in the West, mental ills are either thought of as a sign of weakness or something not even to be dealt with. So if you have someone who is having visions, and I'm not talking, someone who's a Moses or a Buddha or something, but someone who is walking around in a bit of a fog, if you will, is there a sense of compassion? Is there a sense of reaching out to that person to try to get them back? Because we know now through modern medicine that the brain, is just another organ. It can be ill, just like a muscle can be ill, or you can have heart illness. How do Jains reconcile mental illness of the brain with a belief in higher things?
Okay, I'm going to answer this in two ways. I'll jump in, Jeff, if you're okay with that.
Yes.
One is the rhythm of daily life. And what Jain people do, even here in America, is they locate their domicile in close proximity to a temple. And as they go out into the world every morning, this is for lay people, they will visit that temple. And every day as they're coming home, or sometimes they'll go out a little bit later at night, they'll go to the temple and they'll meditate, they'll say prayers, they'll do arati. And this provides sort of a safety belt for the human psyche, number one. Number two is, if someone is disordered, and I'm going to sort of bring in a grisly but documented example from some years back. If someone with severe mental disorder decides, oh, the world is not for me, and enters the monastic life, they pledge themselves to their guru, to their community, in search of both social support, becoming a member of the community, and emotional support. Now, you talked about your friend who had passed, and I expected, well, what karma caused him to have that ignominious end? Interesting. One of the hallmarks of the faith, and back in 1989, and I published about this, I was brought into a room where a woman was 80 years old, fasting to death. And it threw me into a multi-year investigation of this tradition, a return to be in the presence of other people who had undertaken similar vows. And what discovered in a book by Anne Vallely, a great anthropologist at University of Ottawa, was that fasting to death can be seen as a noble way for someone with just inescapable disability, including mental disability, to just drop this body and get another body.
Yeah,
Because as I learned, and it really shook my world, was that the Jains just have this belief that you have always been here, you will always be here, no one can kill you, and even if you fast to death, you're just going to continue. Very powerful.
well, I actually, you anticipated my next question, because in 2009, my mother, who was 86 at the time, did fast for 17 days at the end of her life. She'd fallen, broken her hip. I had taken care of her for over a quarter of a century before, after my father died, and she was just feeling exhausted, worn out. She was going blind, and she went into hospice, and she refused to eat. She wanted to end it, and one of the hospice givers was a woman I didn't like. She was I guess you call it a fundamentalist Christian, who was telling her that, God God doesn't want you to kill yourself and whatnot. Anyway, I called up the hospice and said, please get this nurse the hell away from my mother. I said, my mother made up her mind, let her do it. But there are different types of suicide. Now, technically, my mother did commit suicide, but there's a difference between that and an 18-year-old girl whose boyfriend was cheating on her and dumped her, and she's depressed, and so what are those filigrees of difference between my mother, who was, as Christopher, you described, in that sense, and some younger person who maybe has mental ills, or maybe is just in a momentary despond, if we will, and ends it? Jeffrey, if you want to take that one.
Sure. The term, one of the terms for this process, which Chris so beautifully described, is salikana. And there's a book by a Jain author called "Salikana is Not Suicide," and it makes precisely the distinction that you're making, that the motive behind suicide, as we conventionally understand it, is some despondency, some despair, maybe great anger. There's a state of emotional turmoil that leads one to commit this really very violent act. And in some cases, and even though it's violence towards oneself, it can be a way of saying, well, this will show everyone, right? It's really an act of violence toward your family, friends, people that you feel have disappointed you. It can be that. Um, this process we're describing with very elderly people, it's interesting that you should mention this, Dan, because I had a great aunt and then also a very elderly friend of our family. She had no family of her own. My grandmother more or less incorporated her into our family. She was my honorary great aunt. Both of them, a few years apart from each other, did the same thing. They reached an age where they could no longer do the activities they enjoyed. Uh, their nearest and dearest loved ones were gone, and without really announcing it, they just stopped eating, and they stopped eating, and they let go of the body. And I think that the difference is that this is a very serene sort of sense that this body is done. What I really am is something else that will continue, that will go on. As Chris said so well, we've always been here, we'll always be here, and I'm ready to set this body aside. So it's not this kind of violent rupture with the people in our social circle. It's more of a serene letting go. And in fact, my great aunt, in fact, even said, "Let me go." Right? And this is what she wanted, just to be set free. And so I think it's a big difference. It's a really a death with dignity, and it is peaceful. They're not ingesting a poison, they're not harming the body. They just gradually cease taking any nutrients, and the body just sort of goes on its own.
And it's very important to distinguish, and when I've consulted with physicians about this process, between starvation and dehydration. In starvation, there are all manner of physical ailments that arise. And even though we think that they're starving themselves, in fact, what they're doing is dehydrating themselves.
Yeah.
And when one gets to the latter days, as your mother did, Dan, there's a bliss that an endorphin comes in with this process so that it becomes rather gentle and
Yeah, in the
beautiful.
last few days, my mother claimed there was a woman in blue sitting in the corner watching her.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah. No,
But
and that there probably was a woman in blue sitting in the corner just being her guide. And these types of experiences are really quite remarkable.
before we finish up, and I let you have any final says on things we may not have touched on, a few other points I wanted to just ask that sprung up during the course of the conversation. Um, Number one, when you talk about the sort of the eternal being, one of the things I've often said to young artists is, when I speak of Shakespeare, I don't mean the guy 400 years ago who's under Avon. I mean Shakespeare, the works, the ideas. Same thing if I talk about Picasso or Melville or Michelangelo. We're not talking necessarily about that being. But when you talk about that eternally, you're talking about the thing, the animating force, if you will, the life forces you had said of a Shakespeare or a Picasso or you or me or whatnot. But uh, is there any sense of a greater animating force in these people who are would classically be called the great men or the great people of history, you know, the Joan of Arcs or whatnot, that have made a definite impact? Does that kind of impact count in their karmic sense? Does that make them a more eternal being, if you will?
I'll start by talking about dreams. The big signal within Jain tradition is that when a great being who has worked avidly lifetime after lifetime at self-improvement, when a great being is to make a re-entry into the world, the mother will have a series of dreams. The Digambaras list, I think, 14, and Septembra 16, or reverse. And during a wonderful installment ceremony here at the local Jain temple, they paraded through the streets of Buena Park, whole big circuit yatra, pilgrimage around the city of Buena Park, this remarkable float of the mother of Mahavira with depictions of each of these dreams, signaling that the world would forever be changed for the better by the birth of this great being. And those dreams included animals and beautiful ponds and lakes and rivers and flames and garlands and prayer beads. I mean, it's very specific. Every mother of a future Jinnah, and there were 24 of these great teachers, are said to have had this dream. It's true also of the mother of the Buddha. Queen Maya had this dream of an elephant, and again, elephant, one of the animals in the Jain dreams as well, entering her body from within the realm of the Tushita heaven. And here we go. We have these prognostications of marvel. So yes, not only the trope, but the archetype of the heroic figure is hardwired both into the narratives and all the various stories we're told, but also hardwired into the human psyche. Why do we read comic books? Why do we read those, novels about adventure? Why do we look at those silly things on Netflix? It's because, as Dan, you put it, that Shakespeare speaks to the human condition writ large, and we need those heroes. We need those women who inspire us. We need stories that can help improve our own story.
Well, that sounds sort of like some Western tradition, the belief that a great person is born with a call, you know.
Yeah.
Except this isn't a physical manifestation. It's something that in the mother manifests within the mother's psyche rather than the physical on the baby. Is that correct?
And then the baby has to grow up and find that call. And the Buddha did it because Siddhartha Gautama got fed up with his princely life. Similar story with Mahavira, and the story with Parshvanath, the 23rd, and actually the most popular Tirthankara, is even more dramatic because it goes back 9 lifetimes when his brother slept with his wife, and they just kept on getting born again and again in horrible conflict, with the brother just going down to hell and then coming back up, and Parshvanath going to heaven and then coming back down. And then this remarkable monsoonal showdown where these two snakes sort of rose to the occasion, saved the life of Parshvanath, accompanied him through thick and thin, and introduce a real narrative of marvel and wonder that persists in a rather remarkable way. And there's a little bit of a tie-in with the Shiva story that we see depicted behind Jeff here, that snakes, very powerful, very mysterious, and can really help us when we're in need.
Jeffrey, I want to talk to you a bit about any dietary laws, because you mentioned about veganism and vegetarianism, and famously Jews have dietary laws, the kosher laws of certain animals are considered lesser than other animals. But with the idea of especially veganism, a renunciation of all meat. Now, in the near future, hopefully, if we don't kill ourselves, there are things called cultured meats, in which meat can be grown without having ever been in a living being. But there's also been some interesting science in the last 40 or so years that show that what we think of as individual forests are more alive and more in communication with each other than we know. Giant fungi, for example, can sometimes interact with the roots of plants, and if there's a particular kind of predator that's killing a certain type of maple tree, say, there might be communications between stands of trees that say, oh, if you just up the juice in this maple, that might turn that bug away. The reason I bring this up is that I myself am omnivorous. I don't like the idea of factory farming or any of that kind of thing, and I'm looking forward to hopefully that cultured meat is the way to go. But by the same token, there are some scientific there are benefits that we have in eating the flesh of animals. So what happens if, to a giant belief, if we sometime down the road later this century find out that there's some kind of incipient sentience in plant life? It's like, what do we do?
Well, and in fact, giants believe that is the case, that plants also possess jiva. Plants also have souls. So then the question is, well, then how can you eat anything, right?
You starve on principle.
Yeah, would you starve on principle? And so the giant dietary practice is quite strict. It's not merely vegetarian. There are even some vegetables that are not permissible because for example, if you think of root vegetables, things like carrots and potatoes and garlic and not garlic, but, ginger root, these things involve uprooting and killing the whole plant. So you don't eat those. You eat things that can be picked. Fruits, for the most part, are okay, though fruits with a lot of seeds are problematic, right? Pomegranates are problematic from a giant point of view. They have a lot of seeds in them, and those are believed to have little life forms. Interesting story. Having studied all of this and known all of this, the first time I actually got to spend a lot of time with a giant community, which was actually here in the United States, I went to their temple and stayed for lunch. and I had the full expectation that the food was going to be very sparse. It was just going to be these few items that are permissible. It was one of the best. It was a feast. It was one of the best meals I've ever had. I went back for seconds and thirds because they're very creative about what can be done with those lentils and those, I mean, those things that are permissible. There's a lot of creativity, and so there's all kinds of wonderful dishes that are prepared. So it's tasty. You're not living necessarily an austere life if you're following a Jain diet, if you know how to prepare things correctly. Also, the veganism question is an interesting. It's actually being hotly debated by many Jains today. Chris has probably also been involved in some of the email threads that I've been witness to about this. Milk has traditionally not been seen as problematic from a Jain perspective. Milk is given naturally. It doesn't harm the cow to give milk, and the cow or the goat. And so milk is fine. And there are a lot of traditional Jain sweets and a lot of foods that are milk based. And so the question of veganism has arisen in the contemporary period because of factory farming, which you just mentioned. And that some of the practices, the automated milking of cows, can hurt the cow a great deal. And they can, in fact, be quite cruel. And it's not that someone is deliberately being cruel, but the mechanistic process is inherently cruel. And so because of that, more Jains are saying, okay, uh, milk also now is not okay. It's actually doing harm to the animal. I do know Jains who sort of ensure that they get their milk from some organic source that they know is cruelty free, but that can be difficult. So more are just saying, nope, no milk either. Be completely vegan. And so there is a movement toward veganism among Jains, and it's all based on nonviolence and on compassion for living beings. But regarding plant consciousness, yet there is believed to be that is believed to be the case among Jains. So there are even plants that are off limits in terms of what can be eaten, what can be consumed, and there's an attempt to really minimize our environmental impact, which I find fascinating. One thing I wrote in my textbook on Jainism was that uh, although, at least to all appearances, the philosophy seems to be one of renouncing the world, it could be pointing the way to saving the world because it's this very kind of minimizing of our environmental impact that we really need to do in order to preserve life on Earth. So there's a great interest now. There's a lot of wisdom that is seen to be present in the Jain approach, and that it's not all simply about renunciation and purifying the soul. That's its primary aim, but it has this wonderful secondary effect or outcome of being very beneficial to the earth. So yes, plants, animals. The idea is we should let them be as much as we can.
Chris, oh, I wanted to just ask you about the idea of trans theism in Jainism. And we could go on for hours talking about this, but like I said, this is more of a primer. So after we're done with this particular question, I'll let you both sum up any ideas that we may have missed. But um, so in Western thought, there's the idea that God created the universe. We have the idea in science now of the Big Bang that's been popularized for 80 plus years and seems to be on good scientific footing. And with that, you get, though, the idea of infinite regress, turtles all the way up, elephants all the way down, or whatever metaphor you want to use. But in a trans-theistic kind of universe, if there is no God, if there is no creator, things have always been around. So how does number one, am I correctly stating that belief? And if so, and if modern science is correct that there was a Big Bang that started at least the observable universe, maybe it's infinitely larger, but how does that square with Jain belief?
Yeah, there's one critical piece to the science that remains a question. Is there enough mass that as the universe continues to expand, that it will reach a point where that mass begins to then contract. And if that is the case, it will contract all the way back down again and then go out again. And we're talking, 14 billion years of history. And what the Jains would say without missing a beat, well, of course, cosmologists, there is enough mass that it will come back and there'll be another 14 billion years and then it'll come back, or however many. I mean, it could be another 100 billion out before the contraction, but they would say, no, it's not just going forever and ever. It will recollect and it will happen again. And the Jains were not allergic to large numbers. Their assessments are similarly in the billions and trillions, even as they calculate the extent and the reach of reality. So I'm not saying what they're doing is the same, but what I'm saying is that they have sort of not only found a way to square with this, but they see it as affirming their worldview rather than negating it. So this science versus religion thing, not really an issue. And in some cases, annoyingly, quite the difference.
So
quite the opposite, because sometimes they say, see, science proves.
Yeah.
But in fact, what's most important is the human heart, not something that's, for many, just an abstraction.
A humorist some years ago once said something along the lines of that a universe is one of those things that happens every so often, and that seems to be sort of what the Giants, they just, it's here, and how it got here is not nearly as important as being here.
Exactly.
I mean,
Yeah.
Okay, so Jeffrey, if you would, if there's anything that you feel that you want to talk about, now's the time just to bring it up. If something we may have missed, or if you have a final statement.
Sure. I think rather like Chris, I mean, one of the things that attracted me to the study of this tradition is its emphasis on nonviolence, coupled with the really crucial importance, urgent importance of finding nonviolent solutions to so many of our problems in the world. And the suggestion is not that we all need to become Jains. That's unlikely in any case. But there's an awful lot that we can learn from these values, and that it is possible to affirm a worldview that, I like this term transtheistic that you just used, that it affirms spiritual values, but without necessarily getting into the kinds of intellectual gymnastics that we have to do if we start talking about a God, a creator God, something outside of space and time and so on. That the affirmation of spiritual reality within this realm, and the ability to really achieve heroic heights of moral life in terms of nonviolence, in terms of not harming others, in terms of showing compassion. That the Jains really demonstrate this to a very great degree. And of course, Jains are human beings. I've known Jains who get irritable with each other, and so on, just like anyone else. But the fact that the tradition values these things so deeply really does shape how people behave in their day-to-day lives. And so I like to think that there's this concept you see in the Christian tradition of prophetic witness, right? There are people who really do something extraordinary that's not necessarily expected of all of us, but it lights the way, right? It shows what we ideally should be doing. I think of the Jains as almost something like a prophetic witness for the earth and for humanity, that if we really do want to fix the situation we're now in, we need to move in that direction. And again, it's not that everyone is going to adopt the philosophy wholesale, but even if people ate, let's say, less meat than they do, that would be better than what they're doing now, right? Even if people showed a little more kindness to strangers or to their neighbors than they do now, that would be an improvement, right? So that if we set the bar high, we'll reach further than if we set it low, right? So we don't want to settle for, okay, just doing a little less. Let's try to aim toward what the Jains do, knowing we're probably not going to reach that, but the very effort to do so, I think, would yield enormous benefits for humanity, for the other species on the planet, and I think for all of us, not only in a physical, material sense, but a spiritual sense. It feels good to show compassion. It feels good to minimize the conflict in your life and to see others' point of view and show compassion and understanding. And I think it has pragmatic benefits, but ultimately it's I think where we feel drawn ultimately, though we often don't realize it because we get attached to other ideas and other ways of thinking. So the Jain tradition has been a tremendous inspiration to me, and I think its ideas are important enough that people like Chris and myself need to keep talking about it and um, making people more aware of this tradition.
Chris, same thing for you. Is there anything you'd like to add, or do you have a final statement?
Yeah, I'd like to recall a moment in 1989 when I had darshan, that is a meeting with Acharya Tulsi. And Acharya Tulsi had, by that time, 60 years, headed this remarkable group of Jain monks and nuns. And it was a great honor to be in his presence. And my concern that I brought forward was the environment. What can we do? And he gestured around and he said, here is the solution. And he itemized his possessions, his robes, the receptacle with which he receives food, these little tiny miniature books that he reads with a magnifying glass. And he said, aparigraha. We need to learn to let go. We need to simplify. And what the Jain example provides can inspire us to examine our own lifestyle choices, to become aware of the intricate connections, lift up those that are salubrious and healthful, and set aside those that cause harm. It's too simple, and yet we really have no other alternative. So that's a great lesson that I received from Acharya Tulsi, and as they say in Jain faith and practice, Jai Janendra, let's take that example and move forward doing what we can.
Well, I want to thank both of you. I will link to your university pages below for anyone who wants to contact you or want to learn more about Jainism. And thank you very much for a good conversation.
Thank you, Dan. It has been really pleasurable.
Thank you. Yes, same here.